Welcome to the second roundtable within the Regenerative Surrey programme. My name is Rob Dunford. I'm Director for Business Delivery at Enterprise M3 Local Enterprise Partnership, or LEP. The LEP is a central government funded organisation that works in partnership with local government, academia and business in order to promote economic development in the region. Enterprise M3 covers Hampshire and Surrey, although not all of Surrey and not all of Hampshire. Just by way of a reminder, Regenerative Surrey is a programme of engagement which is building a collaborative approach to attracting investment into Surrey's landscape. This programme seeks to create on-the-ground change, and following these roundtables, we will together map and plan new natural capital projects in Surrey. These projects will be predicated on learnings and advice taken from these webinars, interviews and roundtables. So we encourage you to really take part this afternoon by submitting your questions for the panel. Today, we are looking to explore the role of technology and how that can enable us to achieve more nature-based solutions in Surrey. And in order to fulfil this aim, on the panel, we've got a fantastic collection of experts, all of which represent land management technology solution organisations. We're going to start the roundtable with a series of introductions in a moment before heading into a facilitated discussion chaired by myself. And at the end of the roundtable, I'll be asking the panel two of the most popular questions submitted by the audience. So please do submit your questions via the Q&A and upvote those which you would like to see asked at the end. We'll look forward to reading those questions in due course. So let's start with some introductions. If I can ask each panelist to briefly share a bit about yourself, the type of work that your organisation does, and how that's working to help deliver nature-based solutions in Surrey. So in no particular order, Sinna Foss-Boodle is first.
Right, cheers for that, Rob, and cheers for having me. Lovely to be here. I'm Sinna and I represent No Fence Grazing Technology, which is called No Fence. And I'm heading up the UK office, so we're based just north of Telford, near Harper Adams, for those of you that are familiar with the Agricultural University. And we have developed a virtual fencing solution for livestock. So by using a collar, we fence animals in by using an app on our phones, and the system works in a way where when the animal crosses the virtual boundary that we've drawn, they get an audio warning, and that audio warning tells them to turn around, because if they don't, they get a pulse. So effectively, animals learn to turn around on audio cues, and compared to your standard electric fence, the only change is really that we, instead of using the vision of the cow that they would apply if they were up against a physical fence, we're using their listening skills. They can hear where the boundary is. And this significantly changes our way of fencing. And the idea was sort of developed from Oscar, who is our founder. He was just really tired of fencing. And Norway is a very, or it's a large country and landmass, but we're not many people. We're less than 5 million, which means there's a lot of land. A lot of it is uncultivated woodlands or mountains, and the animals have been unable to graze there because it's been impossible to fence. You can imagine fencing when there is a 1,000-meter mountain going straight up, near impossible. So now we have this fencing solution, and we can actually see that it has benefits for others than just Norwegian goat farmers, which is what Oscar was. So really exciting time for us, and very exciting to be part of this, Rob.
Brilliant, thank you, Sinna. And next up is Dan Geerah.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, nice to meet you, Sinna. Heard a lot about your technology and excited to see it be used more in Surrey. So I'm Dan Geerah. I'm the partnership and growth lead at the Land App. The Land App is an online mapping platform used by many different rural professionals and landowners across the country. That's ecologists, land agents, farmers, etc. And what we do is we provide a really easy to use mapping platform for people to plan their work, whether it's making existing baseline habitat maps or countryside stewardship or basic payment, but in an interactive and intuitive way. So We're not trying to compete with some of the bigger, more complicated mapping platforms. We're really trying to be as easy and as accessible as possible. We work with a number of partners, of which Charlie, for example, who's on this call as well, at Ordnance Survey, we work really closely with them, and a number of other departments such as the Rural Payment Agency and DEFRA, etc., to try and bring spatial mapping to the everyday land manager. What our view is that everyone needs to start really engaging with spatial data, either by themselves or finding someone that can help them engage with spatial data, because the power of which spatial data brings to whole manner of things in rural management, especially conservation and ecology, as well as productivity and nature-based solutions, is vast. And obviously the challenges we face at the moment, we need to kind of use every weapon in our arsenal to start delivering on the ground. So yeah, I think a bit later we might talk about a couple of the case studies we're working on, but yeah, just as a tool, we run on something called a freemium model, so people can come and use the platform for free and go all the way through a process of mapping their individual farm on their own for free. It's when you start being a more professional user, where you want to aggregate and collaborate across the landscape, which we're involved with in Surrey, then we have a professional tier of subscription as well. So if you're interested in getting involved in some GIS mapping that isn't overcomplicated, do check us out and just have a play. But thanks for having us here, Rob.
Thanks, Dan. One of the things that I find fascinating from the perspective of my organisation is the kind of crossover activity now that's happening with different industries taking data from space and others and applying it to new tech. So fascinating to hear about that. Next up is indeed Charlie Draper from Ordnance Survey.
Thanks a lot, Rob, and thanks for having me today. So my name's Charlie Draper and I head up the rapid prototyping team within Ordnance Survey. So we're a new function within proposition and innovation that exists to prototype new commercial and non-commercial propositions at speed. We've worked on a whole host of really exciting projects over the course of the last year, ranging from using machine learning to identify radio jamming incidents, to using Earth observation data to monitor the health of Great Britain's peatlands. And we'll be presenting that work at COP26 beginning tomorrow. So we're really interested in talking more about ways that we can use Earth observation and remote sensing data to monitor different kinds of habitat, not just in mapping their extent, but also in identifying their health and condition remotely and removing that need, or removing some of the need, for expensive and time-consuming ground survey. So that's one area that we're really interested in. We've also joined a sustainability commercial opportunity task force that's been set up by Donna Lindsay, which is looking for commercial opportunities right from across various different sectors and identifying new opportunities for growth in the sustainability space. And what we're really looking to do is produce proof of concepts and prototypes that prove the viability of early stage customer solutions, so that we can develop those further, test them, and ultimately release them to the market. So really interested to hear from some of the participants on this call for their ideas for things that might be valuable prototype solutions.
Brilliant. Thanks, Charlie. That's great. And I mean, Ordnance Survey is a great example of an organisation that collects a hell of a lot of data that's incredibly useful to lots of different people. So really, really interesting to see it applied to land-based and the nature-based solutions. And then finally, on the panel is Carolina from Nature Metrics. And Carolina, can I ask you to, once you've done your introduction, please, to sort of segue into, basically what do we mean by nature-based solutions?
Absolutely. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carolina, as mentioned, and I'm a business development manager with Nature Metrics. So Nature Metrics is a company who uses technology which essentially adopts DNA for environmental monitoring. And this is far easier, faster, and cheaper, and it gives you more comprehensive data. It also sort of illuminates data that you wouldn't have discovered otherwise. My background is in ecology and environmental engineering. I've worked in the UK water industry prior to this role. And sort of in my many years of experience in education, I've designed nature-based solutions in a practical and theoretical setting and purpose. So for the next 5-ish minutes or so, I'd like to sort of give everyone a crash course on nature-based solutions and what they are exactly, to sort of myth bust, if you will, some misconceptions around NBS standing for nature-based solutions, and how they can sort of best be applied. So most people assume that if you plant a tree, here and there, that's a nature-based solution, and you're done. And although in certain situations that's true, you know, for instance, if you have barren, dead ground, desertified ground, or a concrete channel carrying a river, putting a tree there will improve the situation. But ultimately, nature-based solutions have to be looked at as relative. It's all relative. And it's certainly a lot more than just a tree. And so I'll briefly outline why and how. So if you look at the image I'm sharing, so, you know, understandably, there's a lot going on. I know that. But if nothing else sticks in your mind, you know, because you're bored already, just remember one thing. Nature-based solutions are relative. So they're relative to previous or historical land use. And 3 elements must always be considered. So if you look at the top right corner, I know it's a bit much there and you might not be able to zoom in. There's 3 elements that must always be considered: soil, water, and plants. So I call it the trifecta. The most important one of those 3 elements is the soil. So it's the pillar for all others. So the spectrum is meant to sort of help identify which actions are inherently positive, which are negative. And I've assigned sort of arbitrary numbers to these treatments or actions. So they certainly shouldn't be taken as given. They're just used as examples and not based on any sort of specific metric. So the left side of the spectrum represents actions that degrade, while the right side represents actions that enhance or improve. So remember, it's all relative. So on the left-hand side, you have an example of a desertified land. So this is one of the worst case scenarios for lands and soils, as well as for water and biodiversity, because it essentially kills the ecology of the entire area. On the right-hand side, you have a peatland, which is one of the best and most productive uses of land, because it supports all 3 elements of the trifecta. It builds soil in organics, nutrient cycle improvement, nutrient fertility, soil fertility. It also purifies and filters water, acts as a water and carbon sink, recharges surface and groundwater, provides habitats for a lot of, you know, different micro, macro flora, fauna, and enhances biodiversity. So I'll give a sort of practical example of the sort of theory of relativity in a way. So if you have an ancient woodland, which would, of course, be on the right hand of the spectrum as one of the more productive or biodiverse ecologies, and you tear it down, you deforest it, plant a monoculture of trees, which direction are you moving on the spectrum? You're moving to the left because you're decreasing the productivity and biodiversity. Now, if you have an area that floods often, however, and this area is currently covered in concrete or has no actual nature in it or no ecology, and for instance, a land manager decides to create a permeable surface, so rips out the concrete, adds soil, and plants a monoculture of, let's say, a willow stand, which is water loving, then you're effectively moving towards the right of the spectrum because you're building soil, capturing and filtering water, allowing plants to live and thrive. You know, and they breathe, they sequester carbon, etc. So even though it's a monoculture, because of the previous land use, you're actually improving the previous use of the land, if that makes sense. So this is why a relative scale is such an important sort of metric for measuring the efficacy of a nature-based solution. So ultimately, in brief conclusion, the best nature-based solutions are the ones which, number 1, build soil. So you always want ground cover. That's an absolute must. Number 2, you enhance the biodiversity in native plant species. Those are always the best. So essentially create a biodiverse plant cover. And number 3, promote in situ rainfall and overland flow. So anything with, you know, non-permeable surfaces are generally a no-no. So that's, you know, in short, that's a really quick and dirty, literally, crash course on nature-based solutions. And I think we can sort of go ahead and start discussing.
Thanks very much, Carolina. For someone who is a relative novice in this field, that was actually incredibly helpful. So thanks very much indeed. So just moving on then to how each of the different panelists organisations kind of contribute to nature-based solutions. Dan, if I can start with you. Can you give some examples of how your organisation can use technologies to deliver effective and coordinated nature-based solutions, which help to deliver on landscape objectives?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to reiterate, Carolina, that was really, excellent. And I did zoology at uni and then did 3 years of agricultural advice. And we were always taught, it starts with the soil, and that kind of has the knock-on effect to everything. So yeah, if we can just promote both nationally and globally, those 3 things, we're going to be on a good stance. I think the extra bit that we seem to be focusing on quite a lot, which does then naturally include those 3 points, is connectivity as well. So just by having a diverse area, if you put multiple people together, you get increased connectivity. And so if you've got your biodiverse plant species, say, for example, in a wildflower meadow that's, infiltrating soil, what we do as a tool is we try and help those land managers work together to make sure they have connectivity of those biodiverse areas as well. So just one person putting in a wildflower strip isn't going to be as valuable as if that wildflower strip connected to another wildflower strip. So what our tool allows people to do is simply work in 2 dimensions with a bird's eye view and draft up plans, whether that plan is a countryside stewardship, so applying for public schemes, or just a general land management plan where they're looking for either public or private finance. And what's really exciting about this Regenerative Surrey proposal is actually we've got a lot of flexibility, we've got a lot of expertise, but what our tool allows you to do is just simply draw a shape on a map, say what you want that shape to become, and we can start helping people connect with you using cloud-based technology. So all online, it's all private and secure. So your data is not public, but you are in control of your own data. So our tool basically just allows people to foster that collaboration. I'll share you my data if you share with me. And what we can do is put the landowners and the people that represent the landowners in the driving seat, but start to feed in advice, feed in more data to try and make those plans as perfect as you can be in ecological terms. But yeah, definitely focusing on soil, definitely focusing on water, and diversity is key. So yeah, lots of exciting stuff coming in this space.
Brilliant, thanks Dan. And Charlie, same sort of question to you. What's Ordnance Survey's take on the power of technology in delivering effective nature-based solutions?
Well, I'd start by thanking Carolina for the crash course. It's really reaffirms a lot of points that are being made by the Peatlands Observatory project that Ordnance Survey is working on at the moment, and really great to see peatland and wetland right at the far right-hand side of that chart. I suppose I could use that as a case study of one of the ways that Ordnance Survey is working to help promote nature-based solutions. So we've partnered with Space for Climate, a similar in Durham University, to build a peatland observatory to assess the health of peatland environments and inspire action to protect them. And the recent Peatland Health Index that we've produced combines multiple layers of satellite imagery, so temperature, vegetation, and albedo, to provide a score for every 1 kilometre squared of the UK out of 100 to indicate the current condition of peat health for that particular satellite imagery cadence. And activities like this, although there's not a huge amount of peatland in Surrey to my knowledge, this kind of activity of using satellite imagery to help monitor the condition of different kinds of ecosystem could be a really powerful way for scientists and land managers to monitor vegetation changes over the course of time in the UK and potentially worldwide as well, and also to help measure the impact of different programs to, for example, to rewild or to increase biodiversity, to increase the quality of vegetation. We can start looking at how efficacious those projects have been, potentially in close to real time, by using satellite imagery. So we're really excited to drive that action forward and liaise further with stakeholders with interests in that sort of domain. So working together with the Land App, for instance, and other stakeholders who operate in those fields to build things that can inspire nature-based solutions and provide better intelligence on the quality and extent of different kinds of ecosystem.
Brilliant, thanks Charlie. And Sinna, how does the no fence technology help to promote the soil and the water and the plants?
I'd say what we're trying to do, or we at No Fence agree very much that the soil is the base of what we do, and then there are several spheres of, or several areas that fit together. And I think the combination, or livestock, has always been a part of our ecosystems, and it's just about helping improve the management, because that's what we ultimately want to do. So we want to help the farmer find the balance of how long they should be grazing, where they should be grazing, and also do it in a way that we don't interfere with the other natural behaviors or the way nature behaves. So a physical fence can also sort of be a trap for life, wildlife, and we want those things to happen in the best possible way for the soil, which is, I think that the soil is, before we domesticated animals, they moved in herds close together and left the grass behind them to recover and grow. And that's what we want to do. And I think grazing in itself is a really good tool to maintain and increase biodiversity. So just making that simpler for farmers is also a good thing.
Thank you. Caroline, it's sort of turning back to you. How can technology be used to verify and monitor the success of new nature-based solutions? And if you could touch on the work that you do at Nature Metrics and how that combines with other technologies, that would be really great.
Yeah, certainly. So eDNA data, it can help you uncover sort of the hidden data that you wouldn't be able to find otherwise. Because DNA tells you exactly what's in your sample. So unlike sort of conventional monitoring, which are often very invasive, expensive, time-consuming, sampling with DNA kits is actually quite quick and easy. And it also allows for sort of the more civic engagement because of the simplicity with which you can actually use the kits. So we've even had kids using the kits, and when compared to adult sampling in the same area, the samples and the results are virtually the same. So it just goes to show that, the way we've designed the kits, they minimize contamination, they're very easy to use. So it allows for the citizen science aspect to be much more accessible. So there was actually a case study where eDNA sampling over, I think, a couple of days uncovered more data, including hidden data, in a few days than in 30 years that was previously gleaned in the same site. So what's useful about that is the ability for the data, again, to be far more comprehensive. And also, we've been developing metrics and indices. So data as a standalone, is great, but it's the information gleaned and the information extracted from the data that's the real use. So this data will, and collecting the data, and when you have a very comprehensive data set, that's great. When you have a metric and an index, it will help you to understand what the data actually means, and it can indicate health conditions. So you can actually extract insight from it and then ultimately make decisions based on this. So it's ultimately sort of like data with purpose.
Thank you. I mean, one of the things that strikes me from listening to the conversation already is that data analysts are in high demand just about everywhere now, and the more data that we can create as a society, the more use cases and applications we seem to find for it. So I'm going to ask you a question about skills in a minute, but Sinna's just put her hand up, so I'm going to bring her in here.
No, I just wanted to say I totally agree that I think the data is one thing, but then it's what we do with it that's going to make a difference. And I think especially where we work with our customers, we're trying to collect data and then not give it all to them straight away, because we want to give them something that's useful. So tell them, basically, instead of saying this is where your animals have grazed, we can say we recommend you move your animals, or we recommend this pasture that you used last year, because we can see all these trends, because we can see how the animal is behaving and performing. But it shows, I think it just proves the need for those that understand how to read the data and what can we do with it, because that's when the solutions arrive. So we're at the point where we have a lot of data, but we need to use it.
Dan, I was about to say you were nodding away there. Did you want to contribute something? So I'll invite you to do that, and then Carolina will come in.
Yeah, well, just to reiterate, Cinna said, we're finding exactly the same. You know, loads of data is being collected, but what people really need, the people that are going to deliver climate action, is steering on what that data means. Like, we're working towards this idea of, you know, layers of answers, which is basically spatially, can we start notifying people when they intersect an area of high priority woodland planting or high priority where it should be wildflower meadow? And it's not telling the landowner what they should do, but it's using data in a smart way to encourage potentially better practice or better land use. And I think, you know, there's so much knowledge and data out there that we can start delivering this. However, the blocker comes when it's actually trying to get down to the end user. And I think that's where tools like ours do fit in quite nicely, where we're just like a window into data. We're not showing the whole algorithm. We're just a nice portal. And similar with the no fence system, you know, just a nice portal for the everyday land manager to be able to interact with that data. So it needs to be digested and formatted in a way that just makes sense to the everyday landowner. But yeah, completely agree.
Thanks. Carolina, did you want to come in and add something to that?
I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit over here now, because I heard this really interesting woman speak, and she said, we're going to measure ourselves into extinction. And although, so a couple of points. Number one, yes, we definitely need data because it's how it informs decisions. I mean, you know, Nature Metrics is based on data, but ultimately we need enough data in order to act, because we can literally go into infinity and keep measuring more and more and more and gleaning more and more information. But at what point do we say, right, we have enough, now what do we do with this? You know, so that's one point I wanted to make. And then the other thing that goes back to what Cinna was saying, which also relates to, you know, the previous crash course about, you know, making sure that your soil and you have land cover. So grazing patterns and rotations can actually be used to enhance your biodiversity, you know, as Cinna was saying that, but it's very much how you rotate the animals on the land, because, you know, when they actually take some of the plant off, when you actually defoliate 25% of your crop, that is enhancing the growth. So that's number one. That's why, you know, you have herding animals in nature. They actually promote the growth of species. But also, you know, when their hooves are creating sort of micro habitats and they're defecating and urinating, you're creating a natural fertilizer as well. Now, there's a tipping point where if you have the animals in a far too dense area, and they're there far too often, and especially if you have a slope, you suddenly start having erosion and sediment loss, and especially if you have a river that's, you know, adjacent to it, you're creating sediment load and pollution loading into the river, you're losing your topsoil, etc. So it's very, very important for farmers to have like this grazing and rangeland management, and suddenly all my universities just like coming flooding back to me in this course. So I'm not sure if anybody wants to add anything or comment.
Thank you. I mean, the data point is a really interesting one. Most people will have heard the expression that data is fueling the fourth industrial revolution. And I think it's creating jobs that didn't exist before to replace the jobs that we're losing to automation and robots effectively. And so it's a really, really important point that is any amount of data too much data? Who knows? Probably. But I think it's what we do with it and how we make best use of it that's for the good of you know, really, I think we all talk about for the good of the planet now, as well as the good of the, you know, more than the good of the economy. But Dan, you want to come back in?
Yeah, just quickly, I think it's a really good time. There's an old military phrase that if you know 70% of the answer, you probably know enough. And I think there's still an element of that within the sector where we're trying to get to the decimal place of a carbon value to justify a hedge planting, where, you know, exactly as you just said, Carolina, we know a hedge in most scenarios is better to have one than not. We don't need to know exactly how much carbon it is. And that's why I think, and this is what I really want to steer the Regenerative Surrey process, is actually, can we get investment into a holistic management plan that's moving in the right direction, and maybe get some metrics out of that, but not rely solely on the metrics to justify the investment. If it gets signed off by a professional to say that that management plan that includes, you know, soil, water, plant diversity, etc., is moving in the right direction, that's what we need to see in the sector. And I completely agree. We cannot wait for all the data to catch up. The science is still arguing about the carbon, for example, but we know that buffering that watercourse is a good thing to do rather than not. So yeah, I think the inertia can be hit with that data as well. Is that fine balance?
That's a good segue actually, Dan, into the kind of the next sort of part of the question. And actually, I'm going to deviate from the plans. Sorry, Mark, and kind of dip into the Q&A section for a minute, because Jeff has asked a question which has kind of immediately put a light bulb off in my head. It's a long question, but if I can just summarize it, it's addressed to you, Carolina, but I'm going to ask everyone to think about it. And it really relates to kind of the barriers that exist to the implementation of NBS. And Jeff makes a really good point about the NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework, which is something that might send a lot of people into cold shivers. But really what Jeff is saying is that the NPPF fails to comprehend the relative use of land, and just assumes that more land can keep being supplied, but it can't. Land is already in use for something else, just as NBS acknowledges. So do we all collectively have to kind of make a stand against the tide of development? And is there a prominent role for NBS as a way of influencing national planning policy? Now, you might want to have a think about the answer to that question while I ask you to answer a related question, which is the nature-based solutions is something I had hardly heard about 2-3 years ago, and now I'm hearing more and more about it on a sort of weekly basis, to the point where I've been asked to chair this panel discussion. So it's clearly come a long way, but there are barriers to implementing it. And so with a view to, what do you see as the chief barriers to the success of your organisation's objectives with NBS? And I'll start with Charlie on this one, if I may. And if you've got any views on the National Planning Policy Framework, then please do chip in as well.
Well, it's a perennial question, and one that we've been struggling with for a long time. I'd echo the points that are made in the question for sure, but I think it's also making sure that we can communicate the data that we've got effectively is really critical. So just to sort of round back to Carolina's really astute point on having sort of when is the point when we've got too much data, making sure that the insights that you derive from those data are easily communicable to the audience that you have in mind is also really important. So one of the things that we work on a lot is sort of UX design, and making sure that what we produce is tailored to the specific audience so that those insights can be readily understood. And just to come back to the Peatland demonstrator, we were asked to make sure that was comprehensible by school children, because it's going to be streamed to millions of school children next Monday. And that really sort of put the brakes on a lot of what we were doing, and we had to strip back a lot of the detail and just think sort of what are the key points that we want to communicate? How can we make this comprehensible to a 6 or 7-year-old school child? So I would say that I'm not suggesting that the people who run the planning office need that level of dumbing down, but it's probably something that we ought to think about more carefully when we've got sort of papers being generated left, right, and centre, and complex graphs and so on, that a lot of these insights can be rendered in a way that's more impactful.
That's a great point, Charlie. And actually, the individuals that are going to make the biggest impact in this field are probably the ones that are in school now. So being able to communicate with them and get the message through right now is really important. Sinner, what are the biggest barriers to making no fence ubiquitous in Surrey and the UK?
Well, I think I'm not going to pick on anyone, but I think a key point is development in policies and agricultural policies, and that we have something that encourages grazing and land management and soil, so that it's more valued than heads and hectares. So and you've sort of seen there is stuff going on, so the elm coming in and all these developments, but we need more of it. And I also think so there's a combination. So it's the barrier to invest without proper returns, and then the other barrier is knowledge. So I think there is a gap in the understanding between some land managers are really good. They know exactly what to do. They've read all the latest papers and have set up a grazing management plan, and then there are those that have done farming, especially in the way they've always done it, or the way their grandpa did it in the 50s. So we need someone to fill the knowledge gap, and we also need a nudge. to pick up more sustainable practices, I think.
I'm tempted to ask a follow-up question about who's going to fill in that knowledge gap, but I'm going to come back to skills in a minute. Actually, Carolina, what about you from your perspective? What are the major barriers?
This is something that I have been thinking about a long time, and I mean, I could go on like a novel about these things, but I think at the core of this issue is almost sort of philosophical. It's a conflict and a dilemma between an anthropocentric view and a biocentric view. We as people are very reductionist. We take something and we break it down, don't we? We want to understand all its parts. Unfortunately, when it comes to something like nature, nature is like a symphony. You can have each individual instrument and you can hear each instrument play on its own, but it's only when they work and interact together that it's this holistic system. And we're approaching a holistic system with a very reductionist tactic. And that, unfortunately, it's not the best approach. Also, I think that in the past, we've had very, very little scrutiny in removing nature. You know, we've sort of haphazardly destroyed wetlands, forests. I mean, obviously that's still happening. We're deforesting. There's a lot of different variables that are the cause for that, you know, including livelihoods and things like that. But we're just indiscriminately removing nature. And now there's the discussion of, well, we have to so comprehensively understand it in order to bring it back. Well, you know, obviously the whole issue revolves around the fact that we're contending with problems because we've removed a lot of the nature. So our solution should be, well, we should put nature back, but having to understand it to that degree and that very reductionist approach is sort of something that, you know, it just doesn't jive. So we need to have, again, going back to the data, we have to have enough information, enough knowledge, enough data to say we need to sort of restore these habitats, because it's a very real issue and it's becoming more dire every day.
Thank you. Yeah, it's just some sobering thoughts there, actually, and a real reality check and into the urgency of the action that's needed. Dan, just finishing up with you, what are your perceptions of the barriers to kind of successfully implementing NBS?
Yeah, there are still quite a few. I think the education piece just mentioned is definitely one of them. I do think at the moment policy itself is causing quite a few blockers, and I've been working with a group of farmers, you know, in Surrey and across the country really, and one of the biggest causes for inertia is a lot of them think there's a better offer coming around the corner. A lot of them go, why would I go into a deal now when in 2024 that carbon could be worth twice as much, 5 times as much? Because no one knows, and you know, there's no way of telling. It's all supply and demand. But what we need to work out is a way to persuade more people to stick their head above the parapet because it's the right thing to do. Yes, we can make the offer, you know, better financially or better for other reasons, you know, productivity wise. But I think that's one of the biggest blockers that we're finding at the moment. A lot of the people we are working with have got it. And Rob, you said, you know, 3 years ago, nature-based solutions was, you know, rarely chucked around. And I think in a lot of farming circles, a lot of land management circles, it's being chucked around. However, do I plant that woodland or do a bit of rewilding now, or do I wait for me to get some proper carbon credits? And I think that's going to be a big blocker. And I think just kind of in parallel to that is a lot of the government language around elms in particular. It's all about uplift. Now, I think we need to be really careful about paying people for uplift, because you need to reward the ones that have already done the uplifting. You know, from Carolina's original diagram, there's a lot of people that have gone from left to right, but the people that have got the biggest difference have got the biggest to gain at the moment. So, you know, you do hear rumblings of people, you know, I degrade my soil now to get paid later to rebuild it. You know, those are things that government fundamentally needs to, you know, put a knife in straight away. We need to think of a model that rewards almost like a tiered system. You get paid to get to the top tier, but that is the maximum payment when you're in the top tier. You know, without doing that and people just getting the payment for the difference is when you're going to have, you know, blockers to those that are already doing good, wanting to do anything more good, because, you know, why is next door who's been flailing his hedgerow, you know, for life going to get paid more than me that's got an 8 meter wide, lovely corridor? So I think, you know, there's two kind of blockers in there, both policy related, but both very much achievable to overcome if we just have some, you know, some wise people in charge.
Brilliant. I think that's a really good segue into a question about skills and really the future of NBS. What can we do now to educate young people and inspire them to get involved in the kind of jobs that you are doing? You know, the members of the panel, you know, you might want to give us a bit of insight into how you got into this industry as part of your answer, but really keen to understand what do you think young people need to hear in order to inspire them to work in this kind of environment? If I can start with you, Sina, please.
Of course, I'll consider myself young for this context with my 25 years. So just for context, I came in, which I think is going to be the angle of more people my age and younger, is I came in with, I saw this product, found it online, thought this is awesome. They are going to make a difference because of what we know of how grazing fits into our environment, and didn't have any open positions at the time. So I borrowed my parents' car and drove down to say hi, and then they offered me a job, which is a funny story in itself. But I do truly believe that we need to talk more about that there is sort of those that have a very high voice, I think, in solving climate change, are those that are improving sort of, you know, the car industry with electric cars and all these benefits that are reducing, or, you know, where we can stagnate the carbon emissions. But I think if you look at nature-based solutions working with soil, you can actually help reduce. And we need to tell young people there, you know, there's a lot of exciting stuff going on with technology, and you can be working in, you know, a company like No Fence, which develops groundbreaking technology, but we work in agriculture, which I think young people consider a bit old-fashioned. So we need more. Yeah, we need to create a demand for working with this stuff.
Fantastic, thank you. Carolina, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, just echoing what Sina was saying, education is massive, and I think the general trend is that the younger generations are really care about the environment, nature, the ecology. They're very concerned. You know, you look at the likes of Greta and activists like Vanessa, who are quite young, they're in their teens, and they're really pushing for action to be taken. But I think there's still a relatively large disconnect between this whole conversation around carbon and the exact role that nature and the loss of nature plays in that. People think that it's like this carbon market system and it's this easily mediated, you know, problem, but it's actually not that simple. And I think education around ecology as a whole is crucial to the conversation, not only about carbon, but also just about our water security issues, our food security, you know, air quality, biodiversity loss. I mean, nature is at the core of all those things, and it hits all of those points, not just carbon. I think too much emphasis is put on carbon, and carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. I mean, it's only one of many of the different gases and emissions that's causing an issue. And then the second piece I wanted to mention about is just the engagement. So when I was in Canada, I worked for the municipal government in Edmonton, Alberta, and we had a volunteer planting program. So what we did was we identified areas that were being mowed by lawnmowers in effectively useless sort of areas that didn't need to be mowed. So motorways, you know, sort of very steep areas of parks and things like that you wouldn't find people. And so the city started to look at that and said, why are we mowing these areas? We should be rewilding these areas. And so alongside the identification of these sort of sections, they developed a planting program whereby adults, children, teens, schools, etc., the general public were engaged in volunteer planting. So they were sort of quickly trained, and then along with safety measures, educated around what it was that they were doing. They literally got their hands dirty, put the seedlings in the ground, and essentially created these rewilding swaths. And they were able to essentially reforest and rewild, geez, hundreds of kilometers of the city, which had sort of secondary and ripple effects, like flood mitigation, sound barriers, habitat creation. They were finding that there was a lot more birds and butterflies and dragonflies and just general life. And then because of the method with which it was rewilded, nature sort of took on succession. So now it's essentially creating a forest stand. So unlike humans, which sort of take something and we use it and then it's waste, when you have a natural system and it's a native species system, with time, it only increases in productivity, things get better. So by engaging the citizenry, putting in those plants in the ground, and sort of establishing that first primary sort of step in succession, within 10 years, that will grow into a forest stand. And within another 15 or 20 years, it'll be a really rich, beautiful forest.
I think we're going to skip to the Q&A now because we've got about 13 minutes left. There's a brilliant question here from Peter Sutton. He said, you guys are debating how do we use the data. The Wildlife Trusts have shown that what we need to do is increase the total area of connected land supporting nature. And in addition, there is a clear scientific target of achieving this on 30% of the land. So would you agree that the key target for your technologies is to identify the key areas to target and manage biodiversity, flood protection, etc., and at the same time the best areas for other uses, farming, recreation, building, and so on? So can I address that question first to Dan, please?
Yeah, Peter, really great question. And I would say yes, completely agree with that. It's where we're focusing our efforts at the moment. You know, 30 by 30 is a catchy tagline and it means a lot. How we get there is, you know, I think we need everyone around this table to work on it, plus more. One actual case study we're working on with an estate up in Chester, is Cholmondeley Estate, is their estate manager had an idea that every hedgerow that runs through the entire estate, and this is about 4,500 hectares, gets a 6-metre buffer. So they basically pull out the fence posts and put 6 metres either side of existing hedgerows, then add arable margins. And it actually added to about 14 or 15% of their total estate could be rewilded. But it's not like, here's a rewilded section, here's my food producing section. It's a continuous corridor through the whole estate. And I'm like, that type of policy will have such an impact nationally. And obviously, like I said earlier, we can then calculate retrospectively the carbon value or the biodiversity value, but completely agree, 30% is a really nice way to figure it. And one other point I really like about the percentage is it doesn't matter if you own a 10 by 10 metre garden or a 4,500 hectare estate. If you aim for 30% of your land to be dedicated to nature, either through land sharing, you know, growing food in an agroecological way, you know, herbal lays, or, you know, rotational grazing, for example, or, you know, and of that 30%, you know, it can be land sparing as well, where you just dedicate a corner to scrubbing over, for example. So completely agree. There's a lot of targeting happening out there. But as I said in my introduction, I really believe spatial data is key. And that's why tools that we're discussing today, such as Ordnance Survey and no fencing, etc., you know, understanding your context geographically lets you know what your priority is as well. So yeah, we're working on it and really keen to work closer with the likes of Regenerative Surrey and the Surrey Wildlife Trust, etc.
Thanks, Dan. Charlie, Ordnance Survey mentioned there. What would you like to add to that?
I would just say absolutely agree with the premise of the question. Obviously, there's a challenge in understanding and providing incentives for landowners to actually make the changes that are required to see those changes take place. But Ordnance Survey and the Rapid Prototyping team took part in a hackathon with the Met Office earlier this year, where we looked at precisely this question of how do we identify corridors that are right for rewilding. So we looked at the National Biodiversity Index, the NBN Atlas, processed that into a format we could use, access data on hedgehogs, birds, and different indicator species that we could use to do our analysis, and then looked at creating a map that showed the biodiversity of each 10-kilometre square, and looking at areas that reported high bird biodiversity, and then creating a map that sort of showed you where those corridors were that were right for rewilding and increasing biodiversity, so that you can join up these islands of biodiversity. And then a next step for us would have been trying to figure out how we could incentivize this and sort of working together with policymakers to figure out how we can actually look at this, to do constraint mapping and see not just which areas are most suitable for rewilding, but which ones actually have all the other attributes that are required for this to take place. So perhaps them being low quality arable land or other sorts of other factors that might enhance the suitability of those for rewilding. It isn't just a case of saying, here are the areas that we can rewild, but looking at how can we incentivize those projects and ensure that the areas that are selected are actually suitable for such activities.
Thanks, Charlie. I'm just slightly adapting the question for you, Sinna. How would you identify suitable land in Surrey for your no fence technology? And do you see opportunities for collaborating with other people on the panel today or similar companies to make better use of their data to help you with that task?
Yeah, I think right now for the mapping we rely on our customers, and luckily we have a group of people who are very keen and have good objectives. But I think definitely our place to go for this is the panel, and maybe especially Dan and Charlie who are working on map players, because ultimately what we can contribute is that we can look at how the animals are performing, and hopefully we can say something about how they're grazing, which is what should set the stage for how we move them around. Then I think also we can definitely be a removal of barriers between lands or different types of lands, because fences are barriers.
Lovely, thank you. And Carolina, what are your thoughts on Peter's question?
I think as a general rule of thumb, more nature is always better than less. But obviously, in a practical sense, that's not always realistic. So I think, sort of echoing again what Dan and Charlie had said, identifying the most dire sort of areas that are causing the most damage, either to your soils, your watersheds, or your plant systems, i.e. invasives, etc. Those would be targeted as a kind of a primary thing to look at. But also, I can sort of reiterate the 30% of land cover to a rewilding sort of a regenerative effort, because when I was doing my master's thesis on blue and green infrastructure, mind you, this was a slightly different context because it was an urban space, but it still supports the general proportion. I found that 30% at least of a city should be covered in greenery, or to put another way, a permeable surface, because this was in the context of flood management. And 30% was the sort of sweet spot, a minimum of land that should have that kind of a nature natural area, especially if it deals with floodwater, because you want the rain to land in situ and recharge and build your other ecological system.
There's another quick question I want to get to before we close, which is really for Charlie. Do the Ordnance Survey have plans to use robots and their AI to ground truth the satellite data?
I'm not aware of are using robots to ground truth satellite data at the moment, but we do use drones quite extensively for survey, and we're just really interested generally in ways to ground truth satellite data. It's a really huge problem for a lot of projects that we've worked on in the past. How do we validate our machine learning models and get ground truth data that we can then use to train new models? So for example, we did a project on looking at different kinds of heighted vegetation and trying to identify tree health from satellite imagery, and also to identify tree species from satellite and aerial imagery. And one of the problems that we ran into was just not having enough good ground truth data on what the different types of species actually look like from above. So I think the anonymous attendee has hit the nail on the head with a really big area of contention and sort of a big challenge for a lot of tech companies working in geospatial intelligence at the moment.
Can I just quickly jump in? I just don't think we should lose track of there's a lot of experts out there, advisors, ecologists, local farm farmers themselves that are a resource that, as long as the system's good, they can feed in. So although I think it's important that we start exploring technology with robots, I do actually think if we mobilize the sector generally in the right way, we could actually ground truth a lot of it without having to worry about.
Absolutely.
Okay, so number one, always consider the trifecta: soil, water, plants. How are your management strategies affecting those three things? Because they must be integrated together, they work together, they mustn't be separated. And if you're looking to monitor your environment, if you want to see whether or not your nature-based solutions are effective, eDNA can be a relatively simple tool. With a couple of samples, you'll be able to understand whether or not you're actually improving your habitat.
Brilliant, thank you. And Sinna?
I would say never forget that there is a holistic, you need to have a holistic mindset, and your grazing planning is part of that. It affects your productivity, your soil, your water, and we want to be a tool to help improve grazing management, and we're in a place or a space where we're learning a lot from UK graziers. So if you have anything to teach us, then get in touch, and we're happy to listen.
Superb, thank you. Charlie?
I would say that Ordnance Survey is actively seeking partners for our prototyping rounds that we run with the Rapid Prototyping team. So if you're out there and have an idea for an opportunity that would benefit sustainability in Surrey, but that needs the application of data science and some software development to underpin it, do get in touch with me. I'll circulate my email address afterwards, and we would be really keen to have a chat about that more. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Charlie. And Dan?
Yeah, I'd just say if you've got anywhere locally within your own ownership, or whether I live in a city that needs to be improved, just get it on a map and try and speak to someone who knows what else that could happen, what could happen to it. So everywhere could be improved, even if it's city centres or big rural environments. So just get it on a map. And like I said, Land App's free if you just have a play.
Fantastic, thank you. So can I just start to close this down by saying thanks very much to the audience for turning up, and particularly those that are here live now, but also those that will watch back in future. Please do get in touch with any of the panelists who will leave their contact information if you want to ask any questions or pick up a conversation with them. Thanks very much, of course, to the panelists themselves who contributed fantastically to this discussion. Really interesting for someone like me who's not an expert in this field to hear their expert views, and looking forward to the next roundtable within the Regenerative Surrey programme, which is going to be in 2 weeks' time on the 18th of November, and that's going to look at how businesses in Surrey can take action and support the delivery of nature-based solutions. And more details of that will be circulated via the Regenerative Surrey newsletter. So all that remains for me to do is to say thank you once again, have a lovely evening, and we look forward to seeing some of you in a fortnight.